Hi everyone. My name is Christine Bennett. I'm a PhD candidate in the English department at Michigan State University. And since about August, I've been the graduate assistant for Humanities Commons and MSU Commons. And MSU Commons, for those who might not know, is the first institutional node on the expanding Commons network. And so part of my work this academic year so far has been to help as part of the outreach committee for the MSU Commons with onboarding members of the MSU community to the Commons, and generally just to help spread the word about it. I started that process with graduate student colleagues of mine in my home department of English, and after holding an introductory event in the fall, really started thinking about ways to deepen their engagement with MSU Commons tools beyond creating a profile, which was kind of the primary goal of our fall event. We focused on thinking about using the profiles on the Commons as kind of a landing page to anchor professional online presence. And so I kind of wanted to build on that and find ways to help empower graduate students to use the Commons as a way to really get their work out there. CORE, which is now the institutional repository for MSU, is a tool that can help make this happen from my perspective. Sharing work to CORE is a way of validating the work that we do that might not necessarily count in the same way that published articles do, but this other kind of work, whether it be teaching materials, syllabi, conference presentations, this is all labor that should have a place to live. And not only that, but these documents are kind of untapped resources that can be built on and can catalyze future work if they can be found by other scholars. So the MSU Commons Outreach Committee started kicking around this idea of having a core deposit party, which would really be kind of an event that would make space for people, including and especially those new to the Commons, to kind of learn more about CORE, which stands for Commons Open Repository Exchange, and to ask questions about it, to upload their work in real time with those of us who are on the Commons team on hand to troubleshoot. And so the idea with that was that we could kind of simultaneously strengthen CORE and the connections that it makes possible between scholars within and across departments, and also give folks the opportunity to give their work a permanent, discoverable, library quality home. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Bonnie Russell, to share a little bit more about how this event developed, and then we'll get going with the rest of our program.
I do that every time. So hello, everybody. I'm Bonnie Russell. I'm the project manager for the Commons here at Michigan State University. And one of the things that I've been focused on in my work is getting to know the members of the Commons, looking at how the platform is being used, and working to help the members get the most out of it. And so as Christine and I talked about the idea of a core deposit party, we started thinking about themes. And one of the projects I've been working on recently is an article series showcasing successful groups doing collaborative work on the Commons. In highlighting these groups, I'm hoping to help other members find techniques to grow and sustain their own projects. And one of the groups I've spoken to for the series is the Composers of Color Resource Project, which is a group devoted to crowdsourcing and making available annotated scores, learning materials, and other materials to help include more composers of color in music theory courses. Jan Miyake, a member of the Composers of Color's team, has generously agreed to talk about her project in the keynote today. Antiracist and transformative justice praxis are heavily in discussion throughout the academy, and we realized that there was a great deal of work being done here at Michigan State University and beyond that could add to the growing body of work within CORE. As scholars and students come together creating this material, others are in search of it. And both MSU and Humanities Commons give scholars at all stages of their careers a place to share their work, come together, and collaborate with others with similar interests, and serves as a place to find materials and information to add to their work. Today is meant to be the first of what we hope are many core deposit parties organized around a theme. And we hope that today's discussion inspires new thoughts, creates new relationship, and sparks action. Whether that action is simply sharing the work that you've already created, the start of a new collaborative relationship, or simply the consideration of new thoughts and ideas, this is meant as a coming together for any and all interested in pursuing this work. So now I'm pleased to introduce Kathleen Fitzpatrick, Director of Digital Humanities and Professor of English at Michigan State University. She's also the Project Director of the Commons. Prior to this role in 2017, she served as the Executive Director, Associate Executive Director, and Director of Scholarly Communications of the Modern Language Association. She's the author of Generous Thinking, A Radical Approach to Saving the University, as well as Planned Obsolescence, Publishing Technology and the Future of the Academy, and The Anxiety of Obsolescence, The American Novel in the Age of Television. Kathleen, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bonnie. And I want to thank Christine and Bonnie both for everything that you've done in pulling this event together. I am super excited about it and really glad to have so many voices who are here to talk about the relationship between a kind of open knowledge commons and transformative justice, and the ways that that work can be done within the academy. And I want to just very briefly say that this kind of work has been part of the grounding of Humanities Commons since its inception. Humanities Commons began as a project of the Modern Language Association, originally MLA Commons, a network that was designed for communication among MLA members, expanded not only to include other scholarly societies, but also anybody who wants to create an account, anyone who's interested in representing themselves and their work and in being in dialogue with our fields. Humanities Commons has now moved to MSU. It's hosted and its fiscal sponsorship are here at MSU now. And as Christine mentioned, MSU Commons is the first institutional instantiation of the Commons. It's the first time we've opened up the network to an entire institution to say, come join us, come share your work, come transform what the university is and how it functions, from being this space for inward-facing, elite, potentially internal conversation to a space that's really in dialogue with the rest of the world, that's working to become an open knowledge commons. And so the Commons provides, in order to support that sort of open work, spaces for publishing through WordPress blogs and a host of other kinds of websites, a space for profile creation where any member can create a profile that links out to all of their work and makes that work public. And then through Core, the repository, a space for making your work as public as possible. And our goal in all of this is to really ensure that everyone can participate in the production of knowledge and that everyone can benefit from the results of that work. And we see this as an act of generosity that can begin to transform the university from a place that's focused on itself and its own internal benefit to an institution meant to serve the world. And so I'm really delighted to have you all here for this event today, and really looking forward to hearing from our speakers and to seeing where this work that we do together might go. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our three panelists, three graduate student panelists from here at Michigan State University. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll be presenting all at once, and then we'll turn to our first speaker, Ruby Mendoza. Ruby is a first-year doctoral student in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures here at Michigan State, studying cultural rhetorics and professional writing. Ruby, a California native, earned their BA at California State University, Chico in English Studies and their MA at San Diego State University in Rhetoric and Writing Studies. Occupationally, Ruby works as a liaison for the LGBT Resource Center, as a graduate writing consultant, and as a graduate mentor for MSU's Writing Center. Our second speaker is going to be Justin Wigard. Justin is a PhD candidate and University Distinguished Fellow in the Department of English at Michigan State. He is graduate coordinator for Graphic Possibilities, a graduate research workshop that explores digital humanities and critical pedagogy through comics. He is also the co-editor of the edited collection, Prehistoric Monsters, Environmental Disasters, and Shark Weather, Interdisciplinary Interrogations of the Sci-Fi Original Films, currently contracted with McFarland Press. And our third speaker on the panel will be Nick Sanders. Nick is a third-year doctoral student in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures at Michigan State. As an interdisciplinary teacher, researcher, and administrator, Nick's professional interests work to promote equity-driven institutional cultures around teaching and learning that amplify, enrich, and champion students' diverse learning experiences, needs, and identities. He has taught and co-taught undergraduate courses in first-year writing, literature and culture, Writing Center theory and practice, and anti-racist pedagogies. So welcome to all three of our panelists, and I'm going to pass it over to our first speaker, Ruby.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'm excited to present today. Can you all see my screen? Perfect. Let me push present mode. So again, thank you so much. My name is Ruby Mendoza. I'm a first-year doctoral student here at Michigan State University. And just for you all to know, my pronouns are they and them. For this presentation specifically, titled Life-Saving Knowledges, Critical Frameworks to Disrupt Heteronormativity, I will discuss how graduate students' theoretical, educational knowledge, and lived experience can establish coalitional, intersectional, transformative work through digitized and virtual spaces. And through their experiences, graduate students can provide critical perspectives to disempowered, ignored, devalued students who are negatively impacted by systems of oppression. The driving force behind this presentation stems from this question. As racial inequalities and injustices continuously occur within national and global levels, how can digital and virtual transformative justice practices effectively support community members, students, to help navigate their lives within and outside an academic institution? This presentation hopes to answer this question. So in this short and brief 7-minute presentation, I will discuss 3 things. Emergence. How did this virtual and digital speaker series emerge? 2, speakers. Who contributed and participated in this work? And 3, significance. Why is this important? Is this speaker series enough within an institution? So slide for the emergence. How did this digital and virtual speaker series emerge? As Christine mentioned, I'm a liaison for the LBGT Resource Center here at Michigan State University. And as I entered this academic year, the Resource Center articulated that students, through a survey of data, wanted intersectional theoretical work to really help navigate their lives. And for me, this provided an opportunity to propose a speaker series to generate intersectional conversations related to Black feminism, critical whiteness, and disability and trauma-informed studies in order for students to utilize these things in their reading and writing practices within and outside of the academy. I thought this was a powerful opportunity, but also a way to generate coalitional transformative work through community building. As I mentioned on the slide, coalitional transformative justice aids in sustainable efforts towards inclusive, activist, and socially just work. And through the incorporation of different inclusive backgrounds and experiences to present on these various critical frameworks, graduate students, the Resource Center, and I coalition together to produce life-saving knowledges for LGBTQ+ students. So some of you might be asking, how are you defining coalition? Like, where does it stem from? So I pulled from authors Rebecca Walton, Kristen Moore, and Natasha Jones from their book, Technical Communication, After the Social Justice Turn, Building Coalitions for Actions. And they write, an intersectional coalition can readdress inequities across domains of power, shifting norms and connecting the struggles across intersecting systems of oppression. Building coalitions requires an understanding of the way power functions across domains. Coalition members can excuse themselves from understanding the way they wield power in any of the domains. Patricia Collins articulates, this also includes the interpersonal. And so speakers, who contributed and participated in this work? So actually, Nick Sanders is one of them, critical whiteness, he mentioned. Constance Hayward, who spoke about Black feminism, and Tina Puntaseca, who discussed careful composing. So for Constance's presentation, Writing to Liberate White Black Feminism Centers Experience, Community, and Self, she explored the works of early and modern Black feminists. In her presentation, it pinpointed survival and liberation as a primary exigence for ever developing Black literacies. As she articulated, by interrogating overlapping intersectional identity as well as concepts of positionality, workshop participants had the opportunity to utilize Black feminist theory as a means to, 1, understand the importance of Black reading and writing practices, and 2, determine how to navigate and participate in modern liberatory work. Participants, students, also had the opportunity to brainstorm a working heuristic to ethically engage in modern reading and writing practices. The second presentation, Nick Sanders, in their presentation, The Violence of Whiteness and Good White People, notes towards reflective action. He identified the problems of whiteness endemically in a white supremacist settler state by identifying common practices of whiteness in contemporary America. He also addressed ways for students to interrogate the ways expectations for writing practices reflect some of these practices. Participants also had the opportunity to strategize learning and action plans for the ongoing and continual work of disrupting white supremacy. And for the last presentation, Tina Puntasega, and their presentation, Careful Composing Towards an Anti-Ableist Trauma-Informed Community Writing Practices, it attended to the critical need for trauma-informed anti-ableist writing practices grounded in understanding of community care as perpetuated in disability justice communities. Tina also had students consider how embodied knowledges and collaborative composition may confront and disrupt ableist writing expectations. They wanted students to reflect on the embodied nature of their own writing practices while engaging with the role of ableism in academic writing expectations in order to consider new pathways for writing, despite stressful or traumatic experiences. So significance. Why is this important? Is the speaker series enough? Absolutely not. This speaker series is a very tiny fraction of the endless work that can be done through digital and virtual platforms in order to develop coalitional transformative action to support intersectional lives. However, it's a start, a move towards providing inaccessible knowledge to LGBTQ+ students who may need that support to interpret or understand the significance of theoretical conversations and how it can be employed as a reflective method to navigate their lives. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ruby. Next, we're going to hear from Justin Wigard.
Hi, everyone. Can you see the screen okay? Good. All right, perfect. Thank you all for being here. I'm really happy to talk with you. As Christine mentioned, my name is Justin Wigard, and I want to briefly talk to you today about the comics community here at MSU and how in the wake of the ongoing pandemic, we were able to leverage digital means of access to the MSU Comic Arts Collection as a space of online community building. I want to end by demonstrating how we ended up working to connect MSU's comics metadata to Wikidata, and in the process, how we worked to recover narratives of people of color and women comics creators that may have been absent from Wikidata in order to more accurately reflect their contributions in Wikidata or to correct misattributed entries therein. I also have a few links on my slides, and I'll be able to share those at the end of my talk as well. So you don't have to worry about trying to get the whole URL down while I'm scrolling through these. So for a bit of context, as Christine mentioned, I'm also one of the graduate coordinators for Graphic Possibilities, which is a graduate research workshop in the English department focused on comics through two interrelated branches, critical inquiry and engaged pedagogy. Graphic Possibilities is comprised of myself, faculty coordinator, Dr. Julian Chambliss, who actually is in the audience today, Julian, and my fellow graduate coordinator, Nicole Huff. And this workshop is really aimed at community building by bringing together both internal faculty and graduate students, along with external folks interested in getting started with or pushing at the boundaries of comic studies. And we often do this through the means of digital humanities and by working directly with the MSU Comic Arts Collection. Our site is actually hosted through Humanities Commons, and we're really grateful to be part of that space. It's let us host a lot of really cool things on our website. And so for those of you who might not be familiar, the MSU Comic Arts Collection is a special collection in the library that is home to over 300,000 comics and comics artifacts, most of which are American comic books, North American comic books, I should say. Last year, a small working group of digital humanities librarians, staff, and faculty at MSU united to organize and clean up the metadata from this massive collection and release that data set online through GitHub as the Comics as Data North America dataset. This dataset is actually open access and available for the public to interact with and to query, consisting of library metadata MARC records. So right now, you can actually go to the website here, and again, I'll have this link later, and you can look at the metadata for just about every single comic and comics artifact in the library or in that collection, which can easily show where a comic was published and when and by whom. But in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we sought ways to not only support existing connections within the greater comics community, but to build new ones virtually by making transformative use of the MSU Comics collection. So even though we couldn't go to the library archives physically to teach with or to do research in, we realized we had an opportunity to get people working with this comics data virtually. So the Graphic Possibilities Research Workshop hosted a 2-day virtual Wikidata Editathon last October, using the bibliographic metadata to add missing comics publishers and authors from the golden and silver ages of comics. So from about 1929 to 1956 into Wikidata. We partnered with several other comics institutions shown here. And in doing so, we brought together about 55 participants from MSU and across the US. We actually even had a few people join us from Canada and the UK, and we all united into an online community for these 2 days. And so if you aren't necessarily familiar with Wikidata, it is the central linked data repository for all Wikimedia projects. And we ended up choosing Wikidata as this kind of connecting point due to its ubiquitous open access nature. I mean, everyone knows Wikipedia, and so Wikidata is kind of the data version of this. It's free, it's collaborative, it's multilingual, and it's open access. So our goal was to link our metadata from the special collection, which is open but not necessarily super accessible, into Wikidata, therefore more accessible. We ended up using a tool called Mix and Match, which let us load in chunks of our massive 300,000 unit data set and split it up between participants. And for this event, we specifically focused on the golden age of comics and silver age of comics. So essentially the participants log in to this tool on Wikidata, they open it up, and then they get assigned a unique entry. They then examine it against existing Wikidata entries and either use it to create a new entry or to update an old one. So for example, if an entry already exists for, say, Maury Turner, who's the creator of the famous comic strip We Pals, then we update the entry to match with our artifact. And if not, we create a new one. Now, Wikidata can show that he created the comics that we have in the collection. So our first outcome is that in total, we were able to match 2,227 of our authors and publishers from the MSU Comics collection to existing items on Wikidata. And in total, we were able to edit or create 7,700 items, give or take a few dozen, as our 55 participants added statements and qualifiers and references to all of these. This means that we've begun the slow but important process of linking MSU's comics arts collection to Wikidata. So this in and of itself kind of marks the event a success in many ways, but we had more outcomes, which we were really excited about. During the event, we ended up working against Wikidata and Wikipedia bias, the latter being historically implicated in racial and gendered erasure, along with other forms of bias. We were able to make sure that comics created by people of color and by women, specifically comics housed in our special collections, are now officially updated and represented on Wikidata. This also adds legitimacy to these Wikidata entries. They're not just updated on opinions or basis claims, but connected to real, tangible artifacts from the collection. Because Wikidata and Wikipedia are not free from bias, our now sizable online community of Wikidata technicians in comics, we're able to crowdsource knowledge and collaborate to rectify existing entries that were misattributed and to recover narratives from the special collection that might not have been known otherwise. Finally, for our third outcome, this Wikidata event allowed us to bring together folks from all over the globe to interact with and help shape comics at MSU. And excitingly, we've actually heard about several other comics Wikidata events at our partner institutions, including a very recent one at The Ohio State University centered around women comics creators from the Billy Island cartoon collection. So next month, we are planning to host a follow-up event aimed at visualizing Wikidata entries. And to visualize the Wikidata entries that we created in October to try and bring this project full circle, where our initial project was aimed at curation and then it moved into corrections and recovery. Now we're working towards creating new visualizations and reanimating this linked data through interactive timelines and spatial maps and networks and stuff. So I'm happy to take any questions, talk further about the intersections of digital humanities, comics, and community, or the upcoming event. And thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. And I see that for those who are interested in checking out more of the work that Graphic Possibilities does, Bonnie has linked their Humanities Commons page over in the chat. So we're going to move on to our final speaker in the panel, and that's Nick Sanders.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to share my screen. thank you particularly to Ruby and Justin. That was such a very interesting ways we're thinking about coalitional work in these different places and spaces. Oop, on the wrong slide. Different places and spaces. So I really appreciate this kind of thinking and the opportunity to be here. My name is Nick Sanders, and I'm a third-year doctoral student in the Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures. And my lightning talk today is on introspective videos and as anti-racist praxis. And one of the things I really want to talk about in this presentation is thinking a lot about how we can, kind of similar to what Ruby and Justin were getting us to think about, mobilize this kind of coalitional transformative justice work in the context of the classroom. But as anti-racist scholars, and particularly Black women scholars, will kind of teach us, is that any kind of prepackaged practice can actually be very, very harmful. So one of the things I'm advocating for in this presentation is for us to critically reflect on our own positionalities and embodiments, particularly in classroom spaces, and how that might fuel kind of the work that we want to do in the classroom. And I'm going to use video pedagogy as a particular mode that has kind of emerged from my own kind of thinking and my own kind of self-work. And the first kind of thing I wanted to kind of talk about in thinking through this kind of orientation to anti-racism and kind of how I approach anti-racism was around these questions that really center how my embodiments, my identities, and the legacies that I participate in shape my values as a teacher. And by these words are, I think, are very important. I think particularly for me as a white cis queer man in an institution on stolen land, we really have to think about how do those things come to bear in our teaching. And I've been mentored by really wonderful teachers that make us think about these things in very explicit ways. I think as a critical whiteness scholar, I also have to understand that my body is implicated in very contemporary forms of violence. So how is that playing out in the decisions I make as a teacher? Not everything is for everyone, I think is an important lesson in this work. But on the slide, I also kind of point to some of my own values, that part of this is to develop a critical consciousness. I think particularly for white people, we're socialized in ways that really we don't ever really get the full picture of racism. We don't get the full picture of white supremacy. And there's a lot of, whitewashing and things like that. So part of my pedagogy is always about developing critical consciousness, inviting students to be critical of themselves and the systems that have shaped those selves. And to also think in the very vein of Black queer feminisms as the classroom as a place of world making and of future making and of engaging what some folks call the radical imagination. And so some of my understandings of anti-racism are deeply invested in Black queer feminism. This is a place where I know to go to learn. This is a place where I need to, that makes me challenge what it is I know and what it is I think I know. Because the work of anti-racism is uprooting some of these works. The work of transformative justice is to imagining a world that is not yet here. And Black queer feminisms and Black queer feminists historically, as a historical study, gives us so many maps and blueprints to this work, which kind of center on analyzing systems of oppression as interlocking. That is, we can't disconnect race with class, with sexuality, with disability. Those things multiply together. Second is that these critiques power transformations, right? Critique is not the end. Critique is the beginning to making something better, and that we need to center those most vulnerable and those most affected by structural oppression. And last, this really focuses on, very similar to what I saw happening in the first two presentations, the work of coalitional action, the work of accountability. So I think one of the things that I do anti-racist pedagogy training in the Writing Center and in my department. And one of the things that tends to pop up is like, well, how do I do this? Well, it's really hard to say that, because actually me telling you, well, here are 4 ways to be anti-racist in your classroom actually undercuts the whole idea of anti-racism as coalitional, as value-driven, and as future-driven. Instead, we actually really need to think about our goals and our identities and our legacies and the complicated relationships among them in order to drive our goals. So one of the ways that I've kind of started to think about this is through a video pedagogy. And for me, a video pedagogy, and this is the very beginnings of my thinking about what an anti-racist or even a critical whiteness video pedagogy might look like. And it's recursive in that it not only looks at the course, like we were visiting earlier moments in a course, however, it also looks towards sorry, I think I muted myself, our identities before that course. It also invites critical reflection. And I think this is something that we so have to do. We have to think about a thing before we do it. So I ask this not only in the ways I design courses, but what I ask of my students. It's embodied in that it really does center the knowledges that our body has, and even what we need to kind of unlearn, what knowledges we need to unlearn from our body. And this is a really important thing for me as a language literacy person, but it privileges written literacy. One of the big things I notice working with students is they have these baggages around what is good writing. So eliminating writing even for a moment and making it a video kind of does that challenging, and it makes you bring your whole self into the work. And it's also a really helpful critical learning experience in that we can apply and synthesize course concepts in ways that might be more performative in a text response. So I want to end today just by talking a little bit about, two examples of this kind of work. And one appears in when I taught WRA 395, Writing Center Theory and Practice, which is a tutor education course for our undergraduate writing consultants in the Writing Center. And one of the things I invited students to do after reading about the intersections of identity, race, system, structures, class for about 6 minutes was to invite students to think about their own experiences with literacy in language, and to understand how their own values have been shaped by larger social systems. And this is, I invited them to kind of pick whatever multimodal form would be best for them. And several picked video, but others picked podcasts, and some even created websites that really asked them to not only practice the scholarly moves of story, of critical reflection, of application, but it invited them to place themselves at the center of that learning, which I found was really, really important for our staff working with, students across campus on their writing, in that the body part is so centrally important. So that's one possible example of an anti-racist video pedagogy. Another is how I've kind of used reflective videos in my first year writing courses at MSU and other places, which is to design moments of reflection instead of that memo that we often invite students to write. Hey, why did you do the things that you did? What did you learn through this assignment? But bringing that into a video form, which kind of makes it more of a confessional. And I'm borrowing from that language from some of my colleagues and alumna of RAC, Shawanda Ledger, who has done this in her own teaching. And one of my favorite questions on this is, how does your identities and embodiments inform your position and engagement with objects of analysis? What is significant about that? And that should be a question mark. I'm sorry that it's a math symbol. But right, so I think some of these moments of reflection can really be very useful. And in my own class, I've invited students to watch all 3 or 4 of those videos, and then think about that journey and think about what that means for future action. So these are very different options of kind of thinking about video as an important pedagogical strategy in our classes. Again, I'm not suggesting that every anti-racist pedagogue needs to use videos, but for me, it's really important because it centers embodiment. It's a way of enacting my pedagogical values. It also is a way for me and my students to dwell with historical legacies. And it's also a useful, important way of thinking about, we're talking a lot about public scholarship, right? The video is one of the ways in conversations, like I think of Instagram Lives and Facebook Lives and things like that, are really great examples of this work that kind of challenges the tyranny of the letter. But that's kind of what I had prepared for the talk, and I'm happy to chat about any of these ideas further in the Q&A. But thank you so much for listening.
Thank you to all of the speakers. That was amazing. We're going to move now to our keynote speaker, Miyake. Jan is an associate professor of music theory at Oberlin College and Conservatory, where she chairs the music theory division and leads the curriculum and pedagogy subcommittee of the Presidential Initiative on Racial Equity and Diversity. She publishes on the topics of corpus studies, Haydn's instrumental works, linear analysis, and inclusive pedagogy. After being elected treasurer for the Society for Music Theory, Miyake was recently appointed chair of its Committee on the Status of Women. She's a founding member of the Composers of Color Resource Project, which uses Humanities Commons to store, organize, and publicize its resources. So please, everyone, let's welcome Jan Miyake.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Humanities Commons, Bonnie Russell, and Christine Bennett for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to get to reflect on and talk about the really wonderful things the Composer of Color team has accomplished. So I'm here today to talk about harnessing good intentions, online communities, and sustained commitment to racial equity and diversity. There we go. For about the last decade, social media has grown into a space for expressing strong emotions like outrage. I went back through my own Facebook feed to look for passionate posts I made while outraged. I like to think of myself as an earnest person with a good moral compass who is known for following through, but going back to find this post made me wince, not because I didn't follow through, but because I couldn't, for the life of me, remember what specifically precipitated my righteous outrage in the summer of 2016. Here's a quote from the New York Times article that popped up when I Googled that date and the word race. Now, in the space of 3 days, the killings of 2 Black men by Louisiana and Minnesota police officers and the retaliatory murders of 5 Dallas officers, this time by a Black Army veteran, have coalesced all those concerns into a single expression of national angst. In the midst of one of the most consequential presidential campaigns in memory, those convulsive events raise the prospect of a still deeper divide in a country already torn by racial and ideological animus. I may be earnest, and I may have a good moral compass, and I may have even followed through on this vow, but I did so having lost sight of the events that precipitated the promise. Now, I can forgive myself for forgetting, because so many events have happened since 2016 to be angry about that I can't hold them all in my heart. But I had this vision in 2016 that now looks pretty naive. If we all made vows and stuck to them, we could impact the world. If you're on social media, as I imagine most users of Humanities Commons are, you are surrounded by outrage. Dr. Molly Crockett, assistant professor of psychology at Yale University, studies human morality. Here she is explaining why we are surrounded by outrage on social media.
Social media platforms make more money the longer we stay on the platform. This means they have an incentive to present us with information that is most likely to draw us in, to keep us engaged, to keep us coming back and spending more and more time online. The most engaging content is content that triggers emotions, particularly moral emotions like moral outrage. So algorithms built into these platforms that select information to show to us, push to the top of our feeds content that is likely to trigger strong emotions like outrage.
Social media's algorithms promote outrage to make money with the sad side effect of programming us through the use of the like or retweet buttons to keep writing and sharing outrageous posts. So how do we harness the earnest passion that outrage can elicit? It seems like such a waste to let it go untapped. Framed differently, Larry Aubry speaks of sustainable outrage as being key to mounting efforts to change a status quo. Aubry is focused on equality and justice for Black people, a passion I and presumably many of you share. Looking at this dream of equality and justice for Black people, it was hard to imagine what impact I could have. I'm a specialist in the music of Haydn and Beethoven. It seems insurmountable. It turns out that in order to sustain my commitment to this dream, in order to have any hope of making an impact, I had to rely on another passion, teaching. In my position as an educator, my commitment to equality and justice for Black people is humble and looks like this: confronting, truth-telling, and addressing the way white supremacy has underpinned my field of study, music theory. I imagine each of us can find a similar way to make a concrete impact, and that is what is bringing us together today. Okay, so you're in a moment of moral outrage. Acting strategically can be really hard when you're seeing red. So I think the most strategic thing to do in that moment is quite unexciting. Be a joiner. Place yourself in a community that will still be there when your outrage starts to evolve into a slow burn. Is there a Facebook group being developed on a topic you're curious about? Is there a Slack space for similarly outraged scholars in your field? Seize the moment and join, or seize the moment and create that space. Once there, commit to engaging for at least a week. If that's not working out, you can simply go silent or quickly exit. It's okay. We are in a cycle of outrageous events. There will be more opportunities. After a few days, you'll start to see what ideas have traction and in what ways you can contribute. It's this online community that will help you sustain the slow burn that can emerge from moral outrage. And it's this online community that will help you be part of a collective action, like today's core deposit party, to create change. Here's how the Composers of Color Resource Project got started. The outrage came in this context. The field of music theory has been predominantly white and male since its inception in 1977. The field of music theory we study, in 1977, we claimed we studied the music itself. We didn't necessarily study the context around the music. And so we split off from the Musicological Society then. In November 2019, Dr. Phil Ewell, Associate Professor of Music at CUNY's Hunter College, named the problem.
Today, I argue for a fundamentally different approach to music theory's literal and figurative whiteness. I draw on the anti-racist work of race scholars and concepts like the white racial frame, racialized structures, and colorblind racism. I ultimately argue for a restructuring of our racialized structures, a deframing and reframing of the white racial frame in hopes of achieving true racial diversity.
Ewell's talk was received with a standing ovation, but it will come as no surprise to you that there was an undercurrent of older scholars who were very frightened by the attacks that came forth in this on certain important figures in our field, all dead. In March 2020, we all developed expertise with doing work over platforms like Zoom as we moved to remote learning. And after limping to the end of the semester, we felt increased urgency to address music theory's white racial frame as protests took place across the nation, catalyzed by the May 25th murder of George Floyd. In this context, one music theorist, Dr. Lee Van Handel, started a Slack channel called Composers of Color. This was the moment to join. The inspiration for the Slack channel came from the shutdown academia movement on Twitter, aimed at having academics devote a day to focus on long-term action they could take to dismantle racism in academia and in their field. Her original conception for this space was, quote, to hold a workshop where a group of people looked at works by composers of color to see how those works could be used in the theory classroom, and create a resource that would make it easier for theorists to find and use works by POC composers. But she quickly realized that one workshop would not be enough because doing this well requires a plan for long-term action. So her goal for Shutdown Academia Day was to create a space where people who are interested in making this project happen can communicate and share ideas. The Slack channel grew to 215 music theorists, which is impressive given that the membership of the National Society is about 1,200. One thread took off, which was a thread on how to actually do the thing that Dr. Van Handel originally suggested: leverage everyone's new comfort with Zoom to have workshops where we analyzed music by BIPOC composers in small groups, wrote up analytical notes, and tagged our notes with search terms that we would want when we were looking to diversify our teaching examples. We ended up with a leadership team of 6, which eventually became 5 when one person wanted to put their energy elsewhere. And we agreed to crowdsource developing a resource that allows people to treat traditional white music theory with examples that do not all come from white men. That summer, scandals and truth-telling in our field regularly stoked our slow burn back to outrage. Note the number of views on that YouTube video. Since July, we've hosted 7 analysis sessions, generated more than 80 pages of analytical notes, looked at over 80 works by 31 BIPOC composers, created at least 30 annotated scores, presented this all in a really slick way on Humanities Commons, which links to a user-friendly spreadsheet that always seems to have someone, some anonymous animal on Google Docs logged in. We tweeted a lesson plan every day during Black History Month, wrote 2 conference proposals, did an interview, created community, met new people, and have had an impact on the field this year. Our mailing list has 230 unique addresses. It has been easy and natural to lose steam and let things go dormant during the school year, but it takes just a prod from one of us and we get moving again. I'm going to conclude with a few lessons we learned. First, expand your stakeholders as quickly as you can. You're building a base for crowdsourced action. Not everyone is on Facebook. Not everyone is on Twitter. Not everyone is willing to learn new platforms like Slack. Think of all the ways you can get your message out there. We used our professional listserv to make announcements, and this resulted in the participation of many senior scholars who have so much to offer and would not have learned about our events without email. We also made big pushes on social media. Second, you're going to receive criticism, especially if it comes from BIPOC scholars. Be ready to listen, reflect, and make changes. One of our painful mistakes was misdescribing our project as anti-racist work. In the words of Dr. Ewell, what we are doing is DEI work. I cringe to think that we inspired this pinned tweet, but we very well might have. It was a no-brainer to change the name of our anti-racist teaching example spreadsheet to Music Theory Examples by BIPOC Composers, which is actually what it is. And I think we all better understand what it is that we're doing and how to nuance our uses of these terms. Finally, be ready to pivot on new ideas, but stay focused on your mission. For us, it turns out that during the school year, it's harder to capture people's attention to attend workshops, not to mention we all feel pressured for time. We have come up with a variety of ways to capitalize on the rhythms of the academic year to maintain progress on our goal of diversifying the music examples that music theorists use when teaching. A quick coda. This work has been a joy. We're starting to see the impact on our field, and it feels good to provide other pedagogues a simple path towards diversifying their musical examples. But the real joy has been the community, all formed online. By letting Zoom put us all into random breakout rooms during workshops, I've met dozens of new people from 5 continents, put faces to names, and made new friends, all during a pandemic. In terms of the Composers of Color Resource Project, it turns out that we are all at different stages of our careers and have complementary skill sets. Everyone seems to have left their ego at the door, and we naturally take turns prodding ourselves to keep moving forward. It gives me a lot of hope that our online community can continue to sustain our work towards racial equity and diversity in our field. There's so much work to be done and so many people willing to do the work. I hope this framework and real life example gives you some ideas on how you can harness these good intentions the next time that outrage hits. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, and all of our panelists for some really amazing talks. There's so much to think about here, and I want to open it up for Q&A and also say that whenever that Q&A period ends, we have until about 1:30 today as slated for the event. we're happy to use as much of that time for Q&A as possible. And whatever time remains from that, we'll take some time to move into the core deposit party portion. And that work can kind of continue, outside of this event as well. But I'd like to open it up for questions. So if anybody has a question to start us off, please feel free to jump in. If not, I have a question for all of our speakers, but I'd like to open it up to our attendees first to see if anyone has anything they'd like to ask our speakers.
Evan, feel free to unmute, or if you'd like, just put the question in the chat.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for all the talks and letting me ask a question. Yeah, the first question I have, and if there's time for more, I'll see at the end if there's time for more. But my first question is for everybody across the board. Ms. Miyake pointed out the manipulative aspect of social media and how that the outrage, the earnest, passion, natural outrage that it produces can sometimes be manipulated. And in addressing this challenge on using the outrage for productive, transformative justice, as one of the largest nodes in the let's say the buddy press world of like social media networking, is there any interest within the Humanities Commons networks of contributing to like open source solutions for federated social networks to give more accessibility for social media interactions off of these corporate social media platforms that kind of have monopolized the area, but is there interest in maybe expanding into open source solutions and integrating Humanities Commons with, let's say, the federated social network that is kind of gaining a lot of traction, like with Mastodon as an example, where people can kind of have alternatives? Sorry if that was a confusing question.
So I would be happy to just quickly take that on from the Humanities Commons perspective, which is just to say that we do very much hope that Humanities Commons can provide that kind of alternative that you're describing, particularly for scholars who are doing work that is group oriented and of the kind that Jan was talking about, really wanting to bring together groups of scholars who are collaborating on or imagining new potential collaborations for projects that are doing the kind of work that everyone today has described. But that really feels strongly, as we do, that doing that work in corporate spaces puts the work at risk by virtue of the fact that the corporation can take it down at any time, and feeds that engine of outrage that social media survives on. So we really want to provide an alternative that's academy owned, that's academy governed, and that's really focused on the needs and values of scholars working in these kinds of online spaces.
Thank you very much.
For Graphic Possibilities, when we hosted our Wikidata event, we wanted to be cognizant of how Zoom drained we all were, and also, the fact that when we work with comics, people are vocal about comics on Twitter and all social media. And so we wanted to actually be able to have conversations. So we actually set up just a short, informal, private Discord server. So still like a corporate owned thing. But by making it private and only accessible to folks in the event, it felt like a very secure and safe space where we were able to collaborate and have good conversations. And also able to have those conversations through text or over voice, whatever folks were comfortable with. But yeah, all for different modes of access and social media usage.
Oh, yeah, fascinating. Thank you.
I don't know how to add to that question, but I'm just thinking about, accessibility in the way of thinking within and outside of the institution. And so I always try not just to think exclusively within these institutions. We got to think about our students being empowered once they leave, and we forget about that. And so I hope that these platforms and Humanity Commons and the way we're interacting and building coalitions, can you hear me? I don't know if you'll, yeah. That these can be housed, right, in a way that they can be archived and looked back upon, right? And so they can utilize and move forward within their lives and reference when needed. So I hope in that way it's accessible, if that makes sense at all, y'all.
Yes, thank you. I think I really like how you pointed out accessibility from, it could even be potentially cross-platform accessibility, not specifically institutional, but like open access in but like still kind of controlled to make sure the values are maintained of Humanity Commons and everything like that. Very, yeah, interesting. Thank you.
I have a question that I think applies to all of our speakers. I kept hearing as all of you were talking about this idea of coalition building and coming together and forming communities. And I think the way Jan put it, being a joiner, right? And so I was wondering whether we can think about coalition building and being a joiner without also thinking about being a disruptor and kind of making good trouble, right? And how those two things go together, and whether any of our speakers have experienced that in building coalition, whether there's been any resistance that you've met with that you've had to overcome, whether institutionally or externally, and how that sort of has worked alongside the coalition building that you were doing within your community.
And that's a great question. I think one of the reasons why our project has been so successful is it was a rather low-hanging, uncontentious piece of fruit that we picked. And that it was a really safe space for people who are frankly scared of the troublemakers, the good troublemakers. Like, those who hear the truth, but it scares them and they can't engage with it. And that's a lot of people, right? So it's not something we've engaged in our own work. The person who left the team left for really cool reasons. She really wanted to do anti-racist work. And this really wasn't anti-racist work. We are not challenging the fact that it's white music theory. We're addressing the important factor of representation, because representation matters. And it was we haven't had to deal with it, but the good troublemakers who engage with us help us grow. And they don't tend to just come to our Zoom workshop meetings and make trouble. They tend to write, and it's wonderful. There's back and forth, and there's growth, and it's all the things that don't happen on social media. But it's only by using the evil social media that we get our stuff out there. And it's, we don't mean to poke the bear for sure, but the bear gets poked, and then the bear comes and talks to us, and we learn and grow. And so that's been our experience, I think, with Good Trouble.
I just inherently love institutional critique, and I'm drawing from Grable, who discusses that institutions aren't monoliths, right? They're just things that are built on ancestral land. And so for me, this binary of good and bad, I don't adhere to it. I'm just disruptive and queer as F, and as a person who's coming into this institution that's predominantly white, right? I come from California, where we're Hispanic serving, Black serving, and so coming here, I'm afraid, right? Like, is the work that I'm doing within this institution going to get me in trouble? Is this work of critiquing the institution and not serving our populations are getting in trouble? And I'm willing to go through the good, the bad, the messy, the ugly to empower our students, because that's what we need to do, right? We are continuously seeing this acts of violence and white supremacy threaded within our systems. And in order to disrupt that, and this work is not for everybody, right? But I'm willing to do this work. And so I'm willing to do what I got to do to make sure that we're critiquing the institution while empowering our students in order to make sure that they survive and get what they need from here if they choose to be, and they choose to need the information from here.
Yeah, and just to jump off of what Ruby was saying, I think there's a Writing Center scholar who says one of the biggest things we can mistake is that institutions have our interests at hand, and to trust institutions. And I have really complicated feelings about this, but I know a lot of the work that needs to happen, right, is because institutions are broadly very conservative places and spaces. So we do need to kind of do that disrupting. I think a lot about the context in the Writing Center when we rolled out our language statement, which was kind of saying, hey, the ways we think about language in these kind of middle class, upper class, white ways of being really needs to be challenged. You know, we were not just like, this is the thing we're doing, but we talked to people. I know we talked to people at I3, the inclusion office. You know, we talked to the deans in Cal, and we went out to lots of different places just to make sure that we had our folks in line. Because when you know who your people are, I find that's very important. And kind of what Ruby was saying about coalition work, you know, not being for everyone, I think that's super important. There are some times when, you know, when you're at the front of the vehicle taking on a lot of air, that you can be there. But sometimes you have to kind of play aside, you have to play, I don't know, sports, obviously. You have to, I'm mixing like 1,000 metaphors, but you have to kind of support in particular ways. And it looks different, it's very distributed too. And I've kind of found that in the different work that we've done in the department, and in the Writing Center and in different other places. We organized a statement of demands for our graduate program over the summer. There was a lot of work that had played there. So yeah, I think it's messy and it's complicated, it's not for everyone, but it looks different at different areas and places too.
Yeah, and similarly to Jan, for Graphic Possibilities, we try to be intentional with inviting collaborators. So for our Wikidata event, we intentionally reached out to collaborators at institutions that we knew had comics collections or comics archives, or were trying to get comics DH projects off the ground. And we were trying to do so partially because we wanted to learn how they got around institutional roadblocks if they encountered any, and also to sort of crowdsource ways to increase access to all of these resources, and also just to kind of commiserate a tiny bit. You know, sometimes when you're working in specific fields, it can often feel siloed. So when we launched our Wikidata event, we specifically wanted to bring in not just folks working within the academy, but also comics enthusiasts and unaffiliated scholars or public scholars. We had staff, and we had librarians and specialists, because it was really important for us to try and bring in as many voices and perspectives as we could, and also just to collaborate as much as possible. I think whenever we put on an event or like put something out there, we kind of expect institutional resistance in some ways. And we've sort of been fortunate that we haven't run into too much, or at least if we have, it's not coming to mind. The one time that we ran into something, actually during our Wikidata event, we found some weird little Twitter troll who was mad about the way that we were using mix and match. But it wasn't that they wanted us to stop or anything. They just kind of wanted to make their voice heard and rage about it. And so I think that it seems like that sort of shows that we're making good noise, I think.
Just one quick note about institutional pushback. One of the things I love about our project is that we're all acting as individuals. So none of us are I'm not representing Oberlin College. I'm not representing the Society for Music Theory. And it's been lovely to not have to worry about navigating a structure. We're just doing our work and people are showing up, and it's really exciting.
Burton, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. First, thank you all for your talks. They were all very interesting. I think I've learned quite a bit, and I've been taking notes and copying down the URLs. I think the idea of finding your people and finding a way to work with your people is terribly important. And the promise for the different technologies that have been discussed for doing that, I think, is very intriguing. I'm very interested, however, in talking beyond your own people and how you reach out to the public beyond your own discipline, beyond the academy itself, into sort of more transdisciplinary communications with the broader world. I think that there are opportunities for this. There are dangers and pitfalls and everything else related. But I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you think about that. Is that something that you spend a lot of time thinking about? Are you focused differently? And what are the prospects that you think are there for doing some good with the rest of the broader society through this sort of communication? Thank you.
I can go if you all want me to. Yeah, so, I'm very unorthodox. I'm not the traditional student, right? I'm a high school dropout, went back to college in my 20s. I come from a predominantly poor community in the Bay Area. And so I have tensions with the position I'm at. I acknowledge that I'm an immense privilege and that I sometimes feel siloed, right? This information is being delegated and produced for you all, but what about our community members? I try to engage in doing digital work in community engagement. So working with nonprofits that support the lives that need support. And so coming from undocumented parents, I've collaborated with Border Angels to write grants for programs in order to provide life-saving water solutions. I've worked with the LBGT Source Center in San Diego to help support trans health issues. And so all the work that I'm utilizing and learning here, I use it as tools and methods to put it in the real world, because that's what matters to me, is that my community outside of these walls and these institutions are getting that life-saving support. And so when I produce work here, like the speaker series that's through digital platforms, yes, it's centered within the institution, but that information forever will be able to take, for students will be able to take with them outside of the institution, to replicate it, to share it, to give it to their community members. And so the work that I try to do, I try to be intentional in those kind of ways. And I also got to thank Nick Sanders, who helped me think about the speaker series a lot. So, yeah.
One thing that I can say is that Julian and Nicole and I are constantly having conversations about how to make our work actionable, I think is a good way to put it. And so one of the ways that we did that was last year, and we did this with Zach Cruz, who's a recent graduate from the program. We created an open education resource in the form of a LibGuide, and it's in the chat. But essentially, we tried to make a really good starting portal for use with comics, and I think somewhere in there's also some digital humanities stuff too. That's using sources in the library as well as external resources and tools. And we also, as a result of a fellowship, were able to commission or to work with undergraduate and graduate students at MSU to create lesson plans that use the History Makers Video Archive, which is an archive of video interviews from African-American history makers, movers, and shakers. And so we're constantly trying to add to that LibGuide, to that open educational resource, so that we can make all of these things actionable for folks who are not in our field, whether that's in folks who are not familiar with digital humanities or folks who are not familiar with comics. So a lot of our conversations revolve around that.
And for us, one of the conversations that I've been waiting for the academic year to just lighten up a little bit before I throw these at my colleagues, but I got to meet Rachel Barton-Pine, who, if you're a classical musician, she's like this giant goddess of a violinist, and she does a lot of really cool work in anti-racist work and DEI work. And so we were linked to on her website, which is great. She's got a nonprofit. And one of the problems they're having is they need scores engraved. And what that means is that music survives a notation from this tradition, and sometimes it's not easy to read, and we need to go into a notation program and put it in. And we need recordings, because we can't teach a lot of this music without recordings. And this seems like a pretty obvious partnership. So I'm looking to meld these two things together. She has an enormous platform for creating change. And other, the violists are doing something, the flutists are doing something, the oboists are doing something. And these are all outside of the world of music theory, but inside the world of classical music usually. So that's pretty exciting. And I'm really looking forward. I know that my fellow team members will be excited about that too. And I'm looking forward to doing that.
Yeah, and just to jump on, I think that your question around like how are we accountable to our communities is such a central question I think about a lot, like not only in kind of two ways. The first is like how can we as like teachers and people like activate the assets of our students who come from these complicated from the world, that the world of there's the real world and the academic world, and I don't necessarily think they need to be separated. And I think that we really need to kind of think about how they could possibly be a coalitional kind of thing. Another example I think about a lot of like how are we accountable to our community is something that we just started in the Writing Center. Well, not just started, it's been for about a year, but we developed a community writing center where we are in partnership with the East Lansing Public Library, and we're doing it's very piloty and very trying to engage on Facebook Lives with community members. But a lot of the things that we do is how do we, bring resources. We're a very highly resourced university at MSU. East Lansing Library is not as heavily resourced. We have 100 consultants in our writing center, right? We can kind of really do that coalitional work. And one of the things we did, we're doing this week is just a creative writing, but we did a grant writing workshop for community members a few weeks ago. So these are all kind of examples of how we are accountable. Like we have a lot of things that we can help. People might need help. Let's help them. I know lots of my mentors who do the grants with medical rhetorics and humanities will just like, well, I have money, I'll give you money. You know what to do with like thinking about that as the work of coalition and transformative justice too. I think I love this question because I think it's, if we're not centering the communities that we ought to help, like why are we doing what we're doing? So I really appreciate these questions.
Kind of oh, I'm sorry. Was there someone else?
No, I was just saying thank you.
I just wanted to invite everyone. I know we've got about 13 minutes left. If you have materials that you would like to deposit to CORE, we encourage everyone to do that. We still have time for questions. So if there are additional questions, or if you have questions on CORE or on Humanities Commons, we invite those questions as well.
I think there is one question up in the chat from Evan. He asked, second question, if there's enough time, what were challenges or solutions that were met in the projects using the Humanities Commons tools, specifically site publishing and personalization, related to accessibility and literacy in using those tools?
Speaking for our site, I'm not sure that we ran into too many challenges other than, the quirks that come with trying to like do web work in any way. In general, though, it was really nice because it gave us an institutional link to house all of our stuff. And it also made it really easy to, upload all of our podcasts and like video links and things like that. Really, I don't think we ran into any challenges. We've been able to kind of mesh a lot of the work that we do really nicely. Yeah, I wish we had a challenge that I could kind of think through, but mostly it's just been kind of smooth sailing, honestly.
And I would second that. Anything we've needed Humanities Commons to do, it's been able to do. And for us, I think the best thing was before we got that site up, I had 5 links that I was sharing for every workshop and for every social media post, and it was horrible. And now it's one link in one place, and it's incredibly easy to use, and we're really, really grateful to have it. And it's it's branded in an academic way, and we're doing work that's academic, and it's wonderful to have that connection.
One of the things that I'll say too, as the project manager for Humanities Commons and for MSU Commons, and as someone who works with people like Jan or like Justin, is if people have ideas, if they're trying to start a community, if they're trying to determine how it is that they want to kind of organize this, we are available to be able to talk about those things and to be able to answer questions that, hey, I want to do this. How do I do it? A lot of times we're able to say, yes, we know we've done this before. Other groups are using the Commons and they're doing something similar. And we're able to either give examples of other groups or other communities that have risen up. I'm working on the Commons Highlight series, and Composers of Color is going to be the next group that's highlighted. But what we're doing is we're trying to also talk to groups that have been successful and who have used the Commons and created a community. And we're trying to showcase those to help other people think about what they can do and ways in which that they might be able to use the Commons. So if anyone does have any ideas or gets inspired to create something or wants to kind of further their web presence, that's something that we do all the time and are excited about. I mean, I think part of the joy of working on something like the Commons is to watch these communities get created and thrive.
Yeah, I'll just add to that a million years ago, back in the sort of early to mid days of blogging, Dana Boyd said of social networks that they sort of come of age at the moment when somebody does something utterly unexpected with it that works, right? And that sticks and that becomes the thing that social network is known for. And we very much love to see these kinds of organic projects developing out of the community on Humanities Commons, people doing things that we wouldn't have imagined necessarily, but that are enabling the kinds of connective and coalition building work that we really ideally want to see happen.
What they all said.
One of the things that I will mention too in the future of the Commons as a platform is that we are working to create both a STEM Commons and a social science Commons. And one of the things that we're really thinking about and looking at are ways in which that people within the humanities collaborate with people outside the discipline. So we know and are aware of people at MSU who are collaborating across art and social science or humanities and STEM. And so one of the things that I think becomes more exciting as we grow is the ability to really connect people, not just within the humanities or within an institution, but across and within the community. Christine made the point in the chat that, we don't require an institutional affiliation, whether it's to deposit to core or to start a group or to start a site. So for those in the community who are doing work, whether it's work, working with people in the East Lansing Library, teaching writing or having these workshops, those are the kinds of things too that people within MSU or within other institutions can collaborate with community members too. So I do think that the fact that we are institution agnostic really kind of plays into that. Does anyone have any other questions? Are there anything that you want to ask about CORE? We've got about 7 minutes left. I encourage everyone, if you don't want to do it right now, if you have materials to deposit, please deposit. If you have questions or you have any kind of technical questions, please feel free to contact us. And I want to thank the speakers again for just some amazing talks today. Okay. Christine, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
One last thing I would add, just actually as you were talking, Bonnie, it made me think about a point that Nick made earlier about, I think it was Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, but about the resources that the MSU library has and how the East Lansing Library might not have those same resources. And so it's difficult sometimes to get community members access to resources that are sometimes just, sort of jealously guarded within the institution. And that's, I think, what makes CORE such an important resource is that by not having this need to have an institutional affiliation, that you really can get folks in the community to have access to this library quality repository that's chock full of materials that they can use in their own research and to build on and to read and learn from.
Okay. I appreciate everyone for attending. Thank you so much for staying. If again, other questions come up, or if you'd like to discuss anything else, please feel free to unmute and to continue the discussion.
At this time, I'm going to end the recording since I think our Q&A portion for the program is done. Thank you all.